there has been a narrative, and I've gotten a few emails on this, that this is somehow a tax cut. And that is simply not the case. That's not how I see it, and I don't think at least a good chunk of the people in this room would categorize this as a tax cut. This is an offset. This problem was caused by the federal tax cuts. Because of the way they did it, they simplified, they increased the federal adjusted gross number. It was caused by what they did at the federal level. That windfall, if you want to call it that, was intended for taxpayers' pockets, not for the states to essentially get lucky by simply conforming and increasing taxes. And so I do want to just sort of state that from the beginning. I know the narrative has come up that this is a tax cut. This is not a tax cut. This is simply an offset across all income brackets. So, and I also wanted to give Representative Epstein an opportunity to present her amendment and perhaps tell us a little bit about it.
All right. Would you like me to move it or just talk about it, Mr. Chair?
Please just present it if you would.
Okay. My amendment would bring us back to simple conformity. So it simply strikes all of the income tax rates, because we've heard how important it is that we do conform, and for the most part, I've heard general agreement. We should conform. And the sooner we conform to the federal tax laws, the better off all of our taxpayers will be. Our wonderful CPAs will sigh a deep sigh of relief. All of our taxpayers will be so happy they can just go ahead and file, because I know they're jumping the gun out there. They want to get their taxes in. So my amendment will allow them to simply get their taxes done. Then further negotiations about budgets and changes in tax rates and so on can be part of the budget negotiation, which I believe is where it belongs, where we can have time for people to give us public comment about how much revenue does the state need.
Thank you. Representative Grantham, you had a question?
Mr. Chair, I do, for Ms. Epstein, if I may. Mr. Chair, Ms. Epstein, so in essence, you're proposing that we gut lines 16 through 23, which is the 0.11% reduction in the overall rate. Is that correct?
Representative Epstein?
That is the intention. You're right.
Okay. Mr. Chair, another question, if I may, to Ms. Epstein. The federal law takes away a lot of itemized deductions. It makes it to where most taxpayers in the state of Arizona would likely see an increase. Are you supporting a tax increase?
Representative Epstein?
I think it was interesting that Representative Toma decided that this is not a tax cut, so it rose by another name. I think I've heard tax carve-outs are not carve-outs, they're smooth-outs. The bottom line is we're turning away revenue that we desperately need. We know that we have a $930 million debt in rollovers to our schools. We have around $700 million that we should put back into public education to bring us back even to 2008 levels, when we were still at the bottom of the barrel in education funding. We have infrastructure and roads that are in desperate need of repair. We keep kicking the can down the road on that. These are all considerations that we, as the stewards of the state, need to consider. And so I believe that we need to put careful consideration into how much money our state needs before we decide anything about revenue at this early stage in the game.
Mr. Chair, I just, then for clarification for me, it sounds like we would be ignoring the spirit of the federal tax cut, which was to overall reduce the burden on the individual taxpayer. And this, in essence, this amendment would prevent us from doing any sort of reduction of our own number to bring ourselves in line with what the feds had anticipated. So therefore, we would be supporting a tax cut if we adopt, a tax increase if we adopt this amendment.
So let's look at Pat, who is a single dad who might make $54,000 a year. In the best modeling we could find, his federal tax savings might be $836. Fantastic. That is great. With House Bill 2522 and an income tax rate reduction, he might get $35 in his pocket. Okay, but let's take a look at Pat's life. He needs child care. He needs quality child care. Maybe his area doesn't even have good quality child care, and he has to drive somewhere else. So if instead we kept that aggregate amount, we might be able to provide child care supports. We might be able to provide kids care. Maybe his child's on kids care.
Representative Epstein, we're getting into appropriations again.
Because this matters. It matters to how it affects people's lives.
I don't disagree that it matters. I mean, the counter argument to your point, you're basically making the point that $35 is not a lot of money, and that with that $35, if I may paraphrase, that we could do a lot of great things for Pat or whoever at some point in the future. However, I will point out that just because we don't, even if we were to agree to keep the $35 and do something with it, doesn't mean that it would get appropriated to something that would benefit Pat. Perhaps it would get appointed to maybe some mining operation or some other thing that's completely unrelated to this. So that's why I don't want to go down that road, because that's not what we're debating right now. That said, for some people, $35, they preferred for it to stay in their pocket. And remember, the federal government did the tax cut. They intended for that money to stay in their pocket, not for us as a state to opportunistically go in there and take a little part of it just because we happen to have gotten lucky from a technical standpoint. So I understand your point. I understand that we're on different sides of this, but I will argue, simply to give another example, the VLT tax, I've heard a lot about that. It was only $32. This is $35. This is even more. It may not seem like a lot of money to some of us, but to some people it is a lot of money. And quite honestly, I'd rather have it stay in the taxpayer's pocket than for us to debate what to do with it while we're sitting on to correct Mr. Musey, $1.1 billion surplus as I see it, and possibly more. And I actually, for the record, also agree with Mr. McCarthy's point. I know he's probably in the Senate now, that this is still not enough in terms of an offset. I think, from what I understand, if JLBC is here, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, but this modeling, the JLBC note, was based on 2015 tax year. It had changed significantly once they originally based it on 2014. It increased significantly once it was based on 2015. I think if we had actual numbers that were even more recent, that trajectory would increase even more. So with all due respect, I think that this actually still results, as much as I may not like it, still results in additional revenue, even with the offsets that we're providing.
It seems to me an aye vote on this bill will allow taxpayers to keep more of their hard-earned money in their pocket. A no vote will, in effect, result in an increase in taxes and more money in the state's bank account. I personally think the individual who earns the money is a better steward of the money. I think it's quite offensive that we sit here and determine whether or not $30 or $300 is important to somebody. There was a time in my life when 30 was probably a week's worth of groceries, or at least a couple tanks of gas. So, you know, it's apparent to me that there's two very distinct lines here. Increase everyone's taxes and keep the money, or simply let the taxpayer keep the money. I vote aye, let the taxpayers keep the money.